You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome back, everybody, to PolyPat's Paradigm. We're going to talk about the unity and the harmony between faith, philosophy, and science. Once again, here with Eric Robinson. Cheers, my brother. Always a delight to see you.
Cheers, mate.
What are you drinking, by the way?
Oh, just water, tap water.
The good stuff. Yeah, very good. So yeah, I mean, this is a huge subject area. It's certainly one of my favorites. I know that you have a new book out. So why don't you just mention that, and then you can use that to launch into the conversation.
Yes. Well, let me pull up my book cover to show people, because I myself don't even have the book in my hands.
What?
But it is available officially as of like yesterday on Amazon. And so I'm actually doing like a public launch on Saturday, May 1st, to honor St. Joseph the Worker, since it's the Feast of St. Joseph.
Awesome.
But it is already out and available for purchase on Amazon, and it's called Essays in the Deep. You might see that backwards. Oh, no, it's forwards there.
Yeah, but very cool cover.
Yeah, Essays in the Deep, Faith and Reason, Meaning and Morality, Protestantism and Catholic Thought. And it's a collection of essays, 16 different essays that I wrote in grad school when I was getting my MA in theology from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. Pat, I thought to myself, I worked really hard on these essays. Why let that work go to waste?
Yeah, of course, right? Why not compile them? Very smart. Mm-hmm.
And there's really fun subjects and that are really relevant and I think intriguing for people. You know, there's a couple essays about contraception, abortion. There's an essay about transgenderism. The beginning, though, are essays about the relationship between theology, philosophy, and science, which is kind of in your wheelhouse, which is what we're going to talk about today. But my favorite, and then I also had some essays about like Jesus, like proving his divinity and giving proof for his resurrection and all of that.
Wow.
And then I wrapped up with like this dialogue or this commentary between Protestantism and Catholicism, because as a former Protestant, I really want to dive more into the history and also like why is it so important for people to become Catholic? Like why would it even matter that Protestants come into full communion with the Catholic Church? And so my last two essays are my favorite, I would say. And it's the essay 15 is Protestant Revolt and Catholic Reform. And then essay 16 is on the necessity of visible unity throughout the church, which was actually a preliminary essay leading to my thesis, which I released as a book earlier or late last year called Visible Unity, a Calling of Christ for the Church. So anyway, I wanted to not let my work go to waste and thought people might be edified in their faith, in their reasoning through these essays.
Well, cheers, man. Congratulations. That's awesome. So one more time, remind us of the title.
Essays in the Deep, and then the subtitle is Faith and Reason, Meaning and Morality, Protestantism and Catholic Thought.
Awesome. Well, we will be sure to link that in the show notes as well.
Yes, and a shout out to my cover artist, Rocio Ortiz. She's done 3 of my 4 books and has done an excellent job. And so I hired her for this one as well. And I was like, it's so funny, Pat. Like originally, this is bad, but I was going to name my book Essays of Eric. And then my fiance saw that and she was like, "You're not actually going to name it that, are you?" And I was like, I was, but what do you think? And she's like, you got to change it. And so then I thought, Essays in the Deep. That sounds a lot better.
Man, you've got yourself a good fiance there. My wife has saved me from publicly launching countless idiotic ideas, and I am forever in her debt because of that. So it's always good to have somebody who can provide some checks and balances there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this will be fun for you. Like essay number 4 is like the nerdiest title and the longest title of an essay you've probably heard, but I just have to share it with you, Pat. Essay 4 is on the solution of St. Thomas Aquinas regarding the problem of the natural desire to see God in relation to modern European philosophers and Catholic theologians.
That sounds like an academic publication if I've ever heard one.
Yes. But, there's fun titles here, like Essay 10 is Contraception, an analysis of church teaching on the regulation of birth. So
very cool. Yeah.
Anyway, lots
awesome,
of fun
man.
stuff there.
I love just books that are just collections of essays. I think it's an awesome volume. So cheers again. Congrats. I hope people pick up a copy, and I'm sure it will be edifying. So, all right, where do we want to launch our conversation today then, Eric?
Well, I think I would like to start with, like I said, the beginning, the first 6 essays are really about faith, philosophy, and science and how they all go together. And I think we can start with a commentary on, what has happened in the modern world, because it used to be in classical understanding of science that philosophy was considered a science.
Yeah.
Metaphysics obviously it would be a science. And then theology is a science according to classical understanding.
The queen of all the sciences.
The queen of all the science. So I wrote this in the first essay here. I said, so bear with me. I'm just going to read this so we can kind of get these terms correct, and then we'll have some commentary about it. But it says, although the term science in the classical sense encompassed theology and philosophy, in the modern age, it has come to only mean that knowledge which can be gathered through our senses via the scientific method. So like what we can see, taste, touch, what we can see in the material world, what we can test through a microscope, what we can look through a telescope, like all of those things. Mm-hmm. Natural science, or the study of the material world, finds its basis in the philosophical framework that regards the material world as intelligible by human beings. So natural science necessitates philosophy as more foundational. Gathering data from the senses leads to the exploration of causes, and through the light of reason brings the observer to philosophical wisdom, which forms the summit that reason can reach. Philosophy means the love of wisdom and refers to all the reasoned examinations of every aspect of the world from nature to human life. Philosophy then sets the foundation for theology, since the light of reason prepares for the reception and explication of divine revelation. Theology is sourced in divine revelation, which comes through the light of faith. Theology, and here's the key sentence here, theology is indeed a science, since it is logically reasoned discourse about God and involves concepts, definitions, and reasoning. Theology was considered by St. Thomas Aquinas to be the pinnacle of all science, since all true science leads to a deeper understanding of theological truth. Mm-hmm. And then the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle was able to demonstrate how natural science leads to the philosophical exploration of causality, which finds its end in the metaphysical experience of union with the prime mover. But anyway, we have natural science, philosophy, and theology. But what happened, Pat, as you know, is that in this modern world, we've just limited our knowledge, our exploration of the things of the world to what we can see with our physical eyes, what we can test under a microscope, like these sorts of things.
Right.
And I like talking about it this way because there's a certain arrogance in modernism of like, well, we're so scientifically sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
We know better than our forefathers. And it's like, actually what you've done is you've limited your own knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you do that?
Right. Yeah. Wow. A lot there and really good stuff. So just, a few remarks on that. One is, I think it's important for people to know, how convoluted, it is in our age here and now, to get a clear definition of what science is and to say this is scientific or this is not, or this is a science or this is not. So anybody who's familiar with philosophy of science, right, knows that this is a huge issue. Right. And that there's certain philosophers of science or certain scientists who want to say something like, yeah, psychology isn't a science, right? Because it doesn't meet certain criteria. It doesn't have strict enough controls. It doesn't hit a criteria of quantification. Like we can't, get it down into very strict mathematical expressions and stuff like that. But then other people will push back and say, well, hold on. Why should we restrict science to that criteria? Right. Or like criteria of reproducibility or something like that. And so there's all this different criteria that's constantly being argued about of like what actually makes something quote unquote a science. Right. And this is by no means a settled answer. Right. So it's just very like, it's important to put that out there because I think on a popular level, there's this assumption that like, even today we know what science is, but this is not true. Right. This is a raging debate. And I was talking with a friend about this not too long ago, who's an astrophysicist, and he's unsure about this because he's like, well, yeah, he's like, when it comes to some sciences that I'm skeptical that they should be considered a science because they lack certain criteria like reproducibility. He's like, in a certain sense, my field, astrophysics, lacks reproducibility because he studies the beginning of the universe. He's like, that only happened once, right? That isn't something we can reproduce, right? So he's like, if I go by that criteria, then like I'm out as an astrophysicist, right? So. But in the same sense, a lot of his field still has more strict quantification. It can make more accurate and consistent predictions, which you don't see in these other sciences that have suffered what in a contemporary issue, which is known as the replication crisis. Right? There's this huge replication crisis going on in all these different sciences, psychology, economics, a lot of the softer sciences, where they're finding that they can't repeat the results of a lot of a huge amount of studies that they just assumed were valid, and they've been working off these assumptions, and now they realize, oh wow, actually, we got a huge issue here, right? So the point I'm making is I just want to undermine certain assumptions I think are false that people have about modern science. One is that we even have a clear conception of what exactly that is, right? Mm-hmm. We don't, and two, that regardless of like how we define those boundaries, typically what's inside those boundaries are disciplines that are exceedingly various in not only what they tell us, but how successful they are in making their predictions and what exactly they're telling us about, like how much of reality they can capture and how consistently they can capture those aspects of reality. So it's just by no means a clear thing. I will say this, like whatever else science is in a sort of modern sense, it at least seems to have at least a similar theme where it kind of follows an arc, right? Where we start by collecting data, right, in the empirical world, which you talked about, right? And by our, sort of tedious collection of data, we kind of like work our way up inductively to forming some type of general theory, right, to try and help explain the data or make sense of the data. And then we try and use that theory to make predictions, right? Predictions either about the future or about other observations we'll see if we go out and explore. And that's where we say, that's kind of where the deductive arc of science comes in. You say, well, if this is true, then we should see that. Do we see that? If so, then it seems to confirm the theory, count towards the theory. If not, then okay, maybe it counts against the theory, or maybe we just need to do more testing or something like that. So something like that arc, right? Something like that arc seems to capture what most people want to say is science, or the hypothetico-deductive method. But other than that, it's enormously convoluted. So I just wanted to get that out there just to begin the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about this because what happens when you limit your knowledge to the material world, let's say, or to what your senses can intake, naturally you are creating a rift, a division between faith and science now, which all the time you hear that, right? Like, oh, I believe in science, or I trust the science, like, or faith is just this, yeah, you can believe whatever the heck you want. There's not really any intellectual grounding in it, or, it's more like, yeah, you can believe in those myths or those fairy tales, but I'm trusting the science.
Yeah. And what a dumb thing to say. I trust the science. Like, there's one thing called the science, or there's like one group of people called the experts, and it just assumes like the experts never disagree. And like, it's you hear this all the time, but it's a very babyish, kindergartenish thing to say. Like, it's just like, whenever somebody says I trust the science, like, immediately I'm like, okay, you just have no idea what you're talking about. Like,
and I just want to say to them, well, then that's great, because then you trust that theology is the queen of all sciences, right?
Right. So it's just, it's something you just don't hear among like people who think very seriously about these types of issues, what the scientific method is, what does or does not count as science. Like, again, there's other criteria, like, for something to be science, does it have to be falsifiable? People assume that, but that's actually something that's hotly contested, because there's many theories that don't see in science that we use, especially in theoretical physics, that don't seem to have a strict criteria for falsification, but we still allow that in the sciences. Why? Because we think that something like inference to the best explanation is also a valid thing. Like, if it just explains the data in the best way, even if we can't strictly disprove it, then we should allow it into the scientific enterprise. Now, again, that's hugely debated. Other people will say, no, we shouldn't let that be the case. Like, if we can't have some criteria where we could disprove something, then it shouldn't count as science. So even something like that, it's not a settled issue. It's an ongoing, it's just an ongoing debate, right? That rages. To the other point, I think this is kind of what you're getting at, right? Is if somebody does want to restrict our knowledge to the scientific method, if they just and only want to trust the science, right? If they want to say, I'm only going to trust, or you should only trust, right, what comes out of the hypothetico-deductive method. Well, now we've entered the realm of scientism. And the problem with that is just the claim you should only trust that which comes through the hypothetico-deductive method is not something that could ever be verified through the hypothetico-deductive method, right?
Yeah, so it's a philosophy. It's a statement of belief,
right? Yeah, it's a statement of belief.
Statement.
And it fails to meet the standard that it just tried to set for everything else, right? Yeah. So it's like everybody else, you have to meet the standard, but I don't even meet that standard, right? So it's the thing, like, if this is true, then it's false, right? If it's true, then you're out yourself, buddy, right? Because you don't even meet your own standard, right? So we have this self-referential issue. If it's not true, which it obviously isn't true, then we don't have to pay attention to it. So scientism is always going to have that issue of this self-referential, self-defeat issue. Plus, just very quickly, is like, if that's what you're defining science as, again, something broadly like the hypothetico-deductive method, something broadly like that arc, there's so many assumptions that go into that, right? There's logic. We have to assume that logic is telling us something about the world, right? Mathematics, right? That's being fed into that. Morality. That's a huge one, right? Because we just assume that scientists shouldn't lie about their results, or they shouldn't fabricate their results, or they shouldn't deliberately misinterpret their results, right? That's another huge assumption. So these are all of these things. Or the reliability of our cognitive faculties, right? The reliability that there really is an external world as we believe it. That's another assumption that's just being fed right into science. That's not something that science could ever prove, right? So you have all these assumptions, philosophical, broadly philosophical, but in there you have assumptions of mathematics, logic, epistemology, cognitive reliability, morality, that science cannot not only touch, it has to ride atop these if it wants any legitimacy at all. So there's no way that you're ever going to legitimately do away with the usefulness and need of philosophy. And we haven't even gotten to faith yet, by just holding on to a crude scientism.
Yeah. And, to me, once again, to combat the pride of the modern era, I just want to point out that the modern era has really reverted back to pre-Socratic thinking. So it's like, in pre-Socratic thinking, it was like trying to come up with explanations for what the material, like causes of the material world. So they but they trapped themselves within the material world to explain everything. So they were like, well, maybe water created everything, or like maybe like this happened, and it's just like they couldn't think beyond the physical world, and so they had a tough time obviously explaining the world through just that lens. But so we've evolved from that to like Plato, who's like, no, there's like causes of things, and then Aristotle kind of combined a bunch of things to say, like, actually the material world matters. Like, we need to draw from our senses, and then that can lead to these understanding of causes and all of that. And then we see this like kind of arc in human thinking that's progressing. And then like modernism like limits knowledge again, and like we're back to pre-Socratic thinking, and now we're like dumber, you know? So
in certain respects, right?
In certain respects. I mean, we're a lot smarter in the sense of like scientific advancements and technology and all of those things, of course. But in our understanding of the world, it seems like there's been a devolving that's happened.
Right.
And part of that is when you get rid of or you mitigate philosophy and theology, and limit your own knowledge, of course. Like if you limit your own knowledge, it's going to have a dumbing effect. And so it's just, I like to say these things because it combats the pride of the modern era and all of that sophistication by just pointing out, like, you know, you think you're sophisticated, but first of all, as we've talked about, you don't really even know what science is, and that's like the idol that you're holding on to. And secondly, is you're neglecting like way more deep thought into like foundational principles that undergird your whole way of thinking anyway. Right. And it would behoove you to like actually understand those principles so that you can actually progress in the sciences.
Yes, it would be extremely. It would behoove. I love that word, behoove.
It's a funny word.
And I mean, you're right. So there's just also this assumption that we can make if we make progress in one area, we must be making progress in all areas, and that's obviously false, right? If we're making progress in terms of technological advances from certain scientific discoveries, that we're making progress in our philosophy of nature or metaphysics. Why should that be the case, right? I would argue it absolutely isn't the case. Same thing that like we just. In the same sense, we've seen technology progress rapidly in many times, but we've devolved or slid backwards in our morality in many respects, right? So there's not a necessary connection between the forward movement of one area of intellectual inquiry or discipline and all other areas, right? And usually it's just you can move forward in one understanding and you can move backwards in another. And I think that's exactly what happened is, science advanced, but there were many philosophical mistakes, right? We slid into a sort of mechanistic philosophy of nature, a sort of nominalistic picture. And what we've come to realize now, and in kind of philosophy of science, there's what's really being called as this great neo-Aristotelian revival, where many philosophers of science and scientists themselves have realized that their sort of underlying metaphysics and philosophy of nature is actually horribly inadequate to account for science, however we want to define it, but certainly the hypothetical deductive as we outlined, and the findings of modern science. It's inadequate. It can't make sense of it. It can't make sense of either the method itself or actually the world that we've uncovered through that method. So it's actually an exciting time because you have this great sort of revival of these traditional metaphysical notions and this traditional philosophy of nature that not only is perfectly compatible with the findings of modern science, but helps to make better sense of them. In fact, I've got a great book on it right here by Edward Feser. It's called Aristotle's Revenge. And the subtitle is specifically The Metaphysical Foundations of Physical and Biological Science. And that's the exact argument he's making. He's like, look, if you want to make sense of modern contemporary science, not only is the Aristotelian worldview, broadly speaking, perfectly compatible with all the findings of it, but you're actually going to need to presuppose it. And we could get into what those presuppositions are, but he's going to argue that if you don't have this worldview in place, this metaphysics and this philosophy of nature, science can't even coherently get off the ground. Like we really cannot make sense of the method or the findings of science itself. So I just think that's another important thing for people to realize who might not be sort of in the trenches on this stuff. We are kind of going through, I really do think like we're going through this period, certainly among the professional philosophers and scientists, of this waning of this materialistic, mechanistic worldview. Like it really is kind of in its death throes.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is great.
Which is exciting. Now that hasn't got down to the popular level yet. Like we always know there's this great lag, right, between like what goes on in the academy and then it seeps down into the kind of like pop culture. And there's always this great kind of expanse of time or this delay between like when the masses catch up, if you will. So in that sense, the academy, as bad as it is in so many other respects, there's a lot of exciting and cool things going on there that I think are moving in the right direction. How long will it take for the rest of culture to catch up? I have no idea. Mm-hmm.
Well, if this video goes viral, Pat, it'll be very quick. No,
there we go. We'll do it overnight. Right? We'll get there first. Uh-huh.
Well, I think too, as Catholics, we understand that God is the source of all truth, the source of all knowledge. And so to us, it's like there should be, and there isn't really ever any contradiction between faith and science, faith and philosophy. They do serve as a unity because if something's true in philosophy, well, then it's true. And anything true comes from God.
Right.
And so there's never a contradiction between science, philosophy, faith. If there is a supposed contradiction between philosophy and theology, let's say, then our understanding is probably wrong. Like we're probably not thinking rightly about it. But there really is never this contradiction. In fact, they work hand in hand. They call philosophy the handmaid to theology. So theology, once again, is the queen of all sciences because it is it's the study of God, the source of it all. Mm-hmm. And so just to kind of go over the beauty of this unity between natural science, philosophy, and faith, we would see that, like, okay, let's start with the material world. Like right now I'm looking at this tree. This is what my senses can perceive. But if I close my eyes, if I think about what this tree is, like now I'm starting to form a concept. I'm abstracting from my senses, forming a concept, right? And now I can know what treeness is, like what a tree is apart from even looking at it. So my senses have perceived this, but now I have this idea, this universal idea of what a tree is and what a tree is not. And that is something that exists, but not something that I can now use my senses to perceive treeness. It's something that's abstract, right? It's conceptual. Mm-hmm. Or like math is a conceptual science. Like these are things that we cannot, you can't put 2 + 2 under a microscope, let's say, but it's a concept. It's a conceptual thing. And this leads us to ultimately, and you can explain this better than I can, but this leads us to thinking like, wow, if there's these universals, if there's things that that are distinct from the material world, like these concepts, mm-hmm. Well, that means there's an invisible realm. That means that there's something that I can know, but that isn't like tangible before my eyes, or something that like is something that can be tested in the material world. And so now we're getting into metaphysics, which then ultimately leads us to the exploration of causes, and the ultimate cause, the prime mover or God, the source of it all, this unmoved mover. And then that leads us to the limit of philosophy, where it's like, okay, we've used all of our reasoning to lead us to the fact that there is one God, but now that we know that, we yearn to know this God, and that God that we have come to know, like factually exists, we need himself to now reveal his inner being, his inner self to us. And that's where divine revelation comes in, where God reveals himself to us. So we have this understanding that is kind of leading up to God, but then theology is like, God's like, boom, like I'm going to lead back to you. I'm going to come to you. Mm-hmm. And the fullness of that divine revelation is Jesus Christ, God in the flesh. And that's where natural science leads us to philosophy, which leads us to this yearning of this divine revelation, leads us to theology, and theology supports and undergirds all of it.
Right. Yeah, that's beautifully said, Eric. I guess I'll just pick up the thread of the tree, right? So I'll just give an example here of where science really presupposes what I would say is a metaphysics that will entail God's existence, right? So, or forget the tree, like just take human beings or whatever, right? Is that like, if you're a materialist or a mechanist and you think that whatever else reality is just like shapes and motions, right? particles in motion, you're actually going to have a lot of trouble identifying a tree and explaining how it's the same tree over time, right? Because our material parts are constantly changing, right? Like I'm just not the same collection of molecules and particles that I was 5 minutes ago, right? But I'm pretty dang sure I'm still the same person I was 5 minutes ago, right? And if you're gonna lose what we're gonna argue for here is like something like a substantial form in your ontology, right? You're gonna lose identity over time, and then you're gonna lose any person who can hold different premises and reasons in their head and reach conclusions, right? Which you're gonna need for science, right? So you can already see you're gonna start to reach fundamental issues in terms of making sense of experience, right? That there really is identity through time. Like that's the same tree that it was 5 minutes ago. I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago, right? But also I'm going to need that to work through, like I'm going to need to be the same person over time if I'm going to work through different premises to reach a conclusion, right? Like if I don't have that, I can't reason. And if I can't reason, I can't do science, right? So like we already see how fundamental these assumptions are. Okay, well, what can explain this change over time? Like it can't just be the material bits, right? Because we know those are, especially from modern science, right? Like that these are constantly being swapped in, swapped out, right? Rather, there has to be something that informs the material bits, right? That gives them the organizational structure and the systematic unity for any substance that exists. And of course, this is where Plato and Aristotle were exactly right, especially Aristotle, yes, there's a material component to things, but there's also a formal component, a substantial formal component. And he's got his famous four causes, right? And it's that first organizing principle of being that informs the matter, right? That gives it its organizational unity, its kind of distinct suite of causal properties, all that sort of thing, right? And that's not something you're ever going to see under a microscope, right? That's something that science must presuppose. It's not something that science can itself directly detect. What science can detect or figure out are the sorts of causal powers or relations that this thing bears in the world, right? And that's kind of what science does, right? It examines a substance or something we think is a substance, and it kind of says, how does this substance act in the world? How does it manifest its sort of powers, right? Like, I don't know, take a hydrogen atom or something like that, right? It's okay, here's how this acts under certain conditions and circumstances, and then it develops laws of nature. What's a law of nature? I would argue a law of nature is just the law of the nature of something, right? And capturing its sort of powers that it has in virtue of its substantial form in mathematical language under certain conditions, right? So I would argue in order to make sense of laws of nature, you're going to need something like this Aristotelian worldview. And certainly if you're going to make predictions, right? Like if you're a nominalist and you don't think that there are essences or forms in the world, then why should we expect that we can make predictions by just studying, one particular substance and thinking that this is going to hold out there in the world? That makes no sense unless you think that there really are substances and essences, and I can learn about it in a controlled experiment, and then I can extrapolate or infer that there's more things like this kind of thing out there, and they're going to behave like this kind of thing, right? Yeah. So that is an essentialist worldview. How do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of these forms and organizing principles? Well, the short answer, the inadequate one, is this is Aquinas' fifth way, is that there is some unifying idea of all of these things, right? Now, Plato thought that there was this sort of independent realm of the forms, right? And that's kind of called an extreme realism. But the problem with that is now you have this sort of causal interaction problem, right? Because if there's this sort of abstract realm of the forms, the one thing that pretty much people agree about abstract objects is they don't have any causal efficacy, right? Like the number 2, or like treeness or triangularity, like in the abstract, it's not a concrete thing. It doesn't have any causal efficacy. It doesn't have any causal power in the world, right? So how is there this correspondence between this sort of abstract world of the forms and the concrete particulars that seemingly participate in it, right? We've got this sort of connection problem. Like, how do these things line up? Well, the solution to this is what's called a scholastic realism, is we just take what Plato thought was the realm of the forms, and we just say, actually, no, those are just ideas in God's mind. That's all that is, right? And that we have God, who's a concrete individual, of course, a supreme concrete individual, who understands himself as subsistent existence itself, as the fullness of existence, as such. And in understanding himself, he understands all the ways that anything could participate in existence, how something could participate in existence in an electron way, or in a horsey way, or in an Eric Robinson way, or in a tree way. And then he instantiates some of these things. He causes some of these things to exist, right? Through what's called his exemplar knowledge, right? So really, we participate in an analogous way as ideas, as God's ideas, right? And that's how you make sense of this sort of Aristotelian or essentialist view of the world, which, again, I'm going to argue science absolutely has to presuppose, but you're only going to make ultimate sense of. You're only going to make that fully intelligible if you have a supreme organizing mind at the foundation of reality.
Wow. Pat, I think that's enough to chew on for today, in my opinion.
Yeah, man. Fun stuff. Yeah. But hopefully it does show people your point, right? Is that there's not conflict here. And in fact, there's deep harmony, deep concord between faith, philosophy, and science. Exactly.
Cool. Well, I sent you a link here too. I don't know if you can see it, but I don't know if you can put it on the bottom there. But I would just encourage people
in the chat to grab the book. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if people want to check out the book, it's Essays in the Deep, Faith and Reason, Meaning and Morality, Protestantism and Catholic Thought. And Pat, I'm so thankful we got to chat about faith, reason, and faith, philosophy, and natural science today, because you are like the perfect person to chat about this. That like you could have written those essays way better than I could have. I just that was my meager attempt to make
Hey man, it's a beautiful work, and I hope that people grab it. It's such an important subject. We know that people really do think there's a conflict here. There's not. Mm-hmm. There really isn't. This is a pseudo problem. So grab Eric's book, and we pray that it serves you. Eric, my friend, always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, brother. Nice to be here.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.